Rugby World Cup 2019, why did it take so long for Rugby Union to organize a World Cup? The Rugby Union World Cup begins today, September 20th, in Japan, representing one of the biggest gambles in the history of the sport. For the governing body of Rugby Union, World Rugby, the decision to take their showpiece tournament and largest money spinner away from one of the traditional nations and into an emerging market is a huge step into the unknown for a sport that, over a century and a half of play, has shown itself to be one of the most enduringly conservative institutions around. The game was founded by and for England's middle and upper classes, and has largely attempted to be as authentic to those roots as possible ever since. In the initial 30 years from the foundation of the Rugby Football Union, RFU, in 1871, their attitude towards social stratification read, the unwillingness of their players and administrators to talk to people who weren't wealthy, white and British caused football to overtake them as the predominant global football code and sparked the split within their own game that created rugby league. The crux lay with professionalism and their outspoken opposition to any form of remuneration for players. Their staunch opposition to paying players stemmed from the overt class prejudices of the game's founders, who could not countenance that working-class people might be better than them at something and that if they were, it must be because they were getting paid. The best way to avoid defeat to your social inferiors was simply not to play against them. When football began a World Cup in 1930, Rugby League in 1954 and cricket in 1975, Rugby Union remained resolutely without one. The RFU and most of the International Rugby Board, IRB, the forerunner to World Rugby, nations viewed a World Cup as opening the door to professionalism, said Tony Collins, a leading historian of both codes of rugby and author of How Football Began, the preeminent history of the formation of all football codes. They also believed this of league and cup competitions. Touring sides were always haunted by the problem of paying players while they were away from home, and the IRB tied itself in knots over the level of expenses paid to touring players. For Rugby Union at this time, amateurism was the entire raison d'etre. What might come as even more striking to a modern reader is that one of the key factors in Rugby Union finally deciding to sanction a World Cup was South Africa. Despite nearly every other sport in the world excluding the racist apartheid regime from their competitions, football did it in 1963, followed by the International Olympic Committee and the International Cricket Conference in 1970. South Africa maintained membership of the IRB throughout apartheid, with major nations such as England continuing to play games against them well into the 1980s. South Africa weren't allowed to participate until the 1995 Rugby World Cup, after apartheid had ended. Part of the reason that the IRB agreed to a World Cup was the fear that South Africa might organize a rebel World Cup. Players were already being paid to tour South Africa, and there was the danger that this would get out of control. When the meeting was convened to discuss the organization of a World Cup in 1985, Australia, New Zealand and France were in favour, while the home nations of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales were against. The eighth voting party, of course, being the South Africans, whose pro-World Cup stance sparked England and Wales into backing the idea. That said, South Africa were not allowed to participate in the first two editions, and it is thought that the Soviet Union, who would have played in 1987, declined to do so in protest against the apartheid state's continued toleration by the sport. As for the two dissenting votes, Collins explains further, Ireland and Scotland were traditionally the most stubborn defenders of amateur principles. Throughout the history of the game, the Scottish Rugby Union had often criticised the RFU for being inconsistent in opposing professionalism. Wales' opposition to professionalism had become increasingly costly in the lead-up to 1985, as more and more of their players who, unlike those in England, Ireland and Scotland, were predominantly working class were being lost to professionalism in rugby league. Once the decision had been taken to hold a tournament, there was no looking back. As many had feared, professionalism did eventually take hold, though there is no reason to suggest that it would not have happened anyway. Nevertheless, the opportunity to compete on a global scale in a recognized World Cup has done wonders for Rugby Union, particularly in growing the game outside of traditional areas. This tournament in Japan will hope to show how far the game has moved on since 1987, with the hope, too, that it will vindicate the forces of expansion further.